Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 14 now, after the woman from Tekoa, whom Joab sent to the king in order to persuade him to bring Absalom back, has disappeared to be replaced by Joab, who was apparently waiting in the wings all along. And now in the scene we have here from 14:23, as you can see on the left side of the screen, to 28, Joab has gone off to get Absalom, and the narrator shifts from the plot of the story to change on a little sidebar about Absalom's beauty and about his hair and about his children. So we'll have to look at why that might be. So as we've been going through in these two chapters, 2 Samuel 13 and 14, the series of interpretive questions, we're now down to the last two here, and really on this one, 15 today. 16 will come when we get to the end of the chapter, which we're not quite on. Why no mention of a wife or mother to the children here? Why just the name of 3 sons and daughters if Absalom had given birth to them himself? That's one thing we need to be considering along the way. We're also looking at the parallels as we've been between the two chapters. In this case, we saw not these two chapters right away. We'll look at those in a minute. But between the stories in 11 and 12 around Bathsheba and Nathan's little story afterward, and now here the parallel of the rape of Tamar, parallel to David's taking of Bathsheba, and then the death of a child. So here we have the destiny of David's infant son determined by Yahweh, and David acknowledges the inability to cause his son's return from death. And now in our current story, we have the destiny of David's son Absalom determined by David, and David commands his son's return, although they will not meet. And then we'll see this one next time, although we'll actually see we'll see this one next time. So also parallels between our two immediate stories here, and that's where we are down here in the Absalom aftermath. Absalom returns to Jerusalem, but he and his father don't speak for 2 years. And the earlier one in chapter 13, Absalom had killed Amnon and fled to his grandfather's house in Geshur for 3 years, which is where Joab is going to go get him right now. So as we've been looking at our key words, we saw this little chiasm last time, and in many ways our immediate scene, at least is what scholars call an inclusio, where the beginning and the end match, but the inner parts don't necessarily match, because at least from 24 to 28, although the New RSV has them differently, the Hebrew is exactly the same here, for it did not come into the king's presence without coming in the king's presence, literally not coming before the king's face, and did not see the king's face, as you can see here, translating it more literally. And it's all about the face, because as we saw in the woman's last comments last time, she said that Joab had sent her for the sake of turning faces, which is to say, to have Absalom and David face each other. And as we saw earlier, the question of why Joab was sending her, because what we saw, the ambiguity in the Hebrew in the very beginning was the king's mind was either on Absalom or against Absalom. And now we're going to find out which one of those it is. We've been having to read it both ways, whether the king was eager to get Absalom back, or whether he's seeking to destroy Absalom and he has to be persuaded to bring him back. So we'll see how that goes as well. And we've seen how my lord the king in the woman's mouth was repeated more times by her than anybody except Abigail in 1 Samuel 25. Now the language shifts a little bit, and it's still the king though. David won't be called David until the middle of the next chapter, and then he'll be David again. But all this time, which is interestingly personal in many ways, about a father and son, there's no discussion of father and son. There's simply the young man Absalom, as we saw last time, and we'll see again, and the king. So that's what's going on there. And I'll bring up the map, because when we see Joab set off and went to Geshur, we have to recognize it's a long way. Here's Jerusalem, and here's Geshur on the other side of the Jordan, and that's symbolically the other side based on the Exodus story, but we don't know that these readers and authors know the Exodus story, so it doesn't have necessarily that symbolism. The book of Joshua certainly includes that symbolism of crossing the Jordan, but by most scholarly accounts, the book of Joshua is from the time of King Josiah in the 630s or the 620s, so several hundred years after the basic story of the succession is written. At least the way I'm seeing it, some scholars would see this story is later too, but at least for this purpose, let's assume it's earlier, and therefore we don't know that relationship. So all this distance, it would take several days, as you can see from Google Maps. Even the longer distances that people went in those days, it would take longer. And you'd have to go down into the river valley here and come back up the other side. So it would be quite a journey. It makes it sound like it just happens in 1 second. Just like when Jacob's sons go to Egypt for food, they just go down to Egypt and come back in 1 verse 2, the journey not being the key. But we can imagine what that was like. And maybe we should, to just try to get a feel for this. Is Absalom Absalom waiting eagerly all this time? Is his grandfather, who's not mentioned here, offering him local power there? We recall that we were told that not only Absalom's grandfather Talmai, but Talmai's father had been kings in this region. We don't know the extent of that, historically or textually, but certainly he's coming from a family of power, and he went back there and had been there for quite some time. So we don't know whether he's coming back with plans of revolution that his grandfather has helped him with, or whether he's just eager to see his father. And we don't know nothing about his family of origin there other than that. We don't know what conversation there would have been along the way, and they would have had a lot of time to talk. As far as the text is telling us, it's just the two of them. But it seems very unlikely that Joab would go on a solo journey. He certainly brings some young men with him for food and for safety and security. So there's certainly a party of people that are on this trip, but again, nothing about it. And when they get back, we see this in verse 24. Before we do, let's look at a couple of details of verse 23 here. So the word for set off here is literally stood up. So Joab stood up, contrasting with his being prostrated before the king in the previous verse. And so it's not just that he set off, that he stood up and is ready to go. Went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. And again, as I was noting, no specific conversation about that. So putting our text back up, and we see here, starting in verse 24, as my note below has, these next four verses are full of seeing and not seeing, both the beauty of Absalom and the face of the king. And we can see again that little chiasm I just noted. So the king said, but we don't know who he's speaking to. We don't know if Joab and Absalom are in the king's presence. All we were told is he brought Absalom to Jerusalem. But he didn't say he brought him to the king's house, or he didn't say he brought him to Absalom's house. Presumably Absalom still has the house that he was in earlier when he brought Tamar into his house after the rape. But we've not heard about Tamar again, and we've not heard about Absalom's house. So we don't know where either Absalom or Joab is, but presumably the king here is talking to Joab because he's the one responsible, Joab that is, for Absalom's presence. So the text doesn't tell us, but we have to assume that. Let him go to his own house. And notice they won't even say it by name. Not my son, not the young man, not Absalom. Just let him go. And so, as my note below has, officially the house of David and the house of Absalom are separated, anticipating the successors, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. At a personal level, this is a cruel rejection of his son, which hardens the division. But on the David knows what he's doing interpretation, this sets Absalom on the path to the rebellion and excuse for his death. Which is to say, one of the questions I've been asking throughout these two chapters is, since David has been characterized throughout the story so far as astute and alert and very aware of threats against his life, especially from people like Saul, is it credible that he suddenly seems oblivious of all the intrigue and violence that's going on directly in front of him, like the rape of Tamar and the murder of Amnon, or the plotting of Absalom to rebel? Because as soon as this chapter is over, in the very first verse of chapter 15, Absalom will begin his rebellion, and it will be on. So, does it seem likely that David is suddenly just completely oblivious? As I noted a couple of videos ago, when this is over, David will still be king and Absalom will be dead. So he's certainly still got his wits about him, not just the immediate ones, but the long-term strategic ones. So we can decide that for ourselves about whether the king is keeping him away out of a personal animosity, that he's still angry with Absalom over the death of Amnon, or whether he's suspicious of Absalom's potential rebellion and he just doesn't want to see him, or something else that we don't know since the text doesn't tell us. So he's not to come, not just into my presence, but not to see my face. So Absalom went to his own house and did not come before the king's face. So face twice in that verse, and one of a number of times that we'll see, as we see over here on the right side. So suddenly it shifts. And we really have to wonder, as Falkman notes below, Absalom's beauty is wedged in between verses about not seeing, between David's adamant refusal to offer his son contact and the very continuation of this measure. So twice about not seeing the face, suddenly we see how beautiful this person is from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Notice it's in all Israel. Is this contrasting with Judah? Certainly key to what's going to follow is the difference between Israel and Judah, and we've seen that was key in David's accession to the throne, that Saul had been Israel's realm and Judah and Jerusalem were the realm that David had acquired, and that Israel and Judah separately were given to him as part of his reign. And so we can certainly see Israel as separate and the northern kingdom that will eventually be separate. But is that what's being described here, or is this like all the people of Yahweh? We're not sure. They're certainly not in Israel right now. They're in Judah right now, in Jerusalem. So, now, in all Israel or wherever, there was no one to be praised, Hallel here, Meod, or praised so much, a word used 144 times in the Masoretic text, but 89 times in Psalms, and the only other time in Samuel is in the Psalm out of David's mouth here in 2 Samuel 22. It's not elsewhere in Samuel. It's in 1 Kings 20, and interestingly in Genesis, where Sarai is praised for her beauty as well, and that matches the words for beauty for his daughter Tamar that we'll see in a couple of verses. So it's not only that he's beautiful, he's being praised for his beauty, although don't hear that he is praised. We hear there's no one to be praised for his beauty. And the Ish Yapha here, a man of beauty, as Joseph is in Genesis, as David is, Abigail, obviously a woman of beauty, and both Tamars, as we saw at the beginning of 2 Samuel 13, and we'll see in just a couple of verses, as well as David's bedside companion Abishag, who's there not to be beautiful, but to keep him warm. At least that's what the text tells us when we get there. So Absalom is very beautiful, but he's the only one described this way. Literally from the palm of his foot to the crown of his head, quad there, used as an identical phrase here in Deuteronomy 28:35, but the opposite way. Yahweh will strike you on the knees and the legs with grievous boils of which you cannot be healed from the sole of your foot to the crown of your head. So clearly a proverbial way to speak about the whole body, not talking specifically about the foot and head, but everything in between, like day and night covers twilight and dawn as well. But in addition to that, no blemish on him, which is the word used often for sacrificial lambs, mum here. It's only here in the Deuteronomistic history other than in Genesis, but in Leviticus it's used a number of times for you can't sacrifice an animal that has a blemish. And Absalom, we could hear, as being sacrificed for David's succession. And that parallels the interpretation I was offering, that Tamar was being offered in sacrifice by the symbolism of her putting her hand on her head as she went out in public after she was raped. So two suggestions here in the text, as subtle as they are, that David's children, if Tamar's his daughter, or at least the brother and sister pair, Tamar and Absalom, are being offered as a sacrifice on behalf of the monarchy. We'll have to decide if that's how we interpret it later as we continue. So in verse 26, we see the hair cutting, and this is the only time we see anything this specific. Notice how it matches the sheep shearing, where the sheep hair needed to be cut, and that was the cover for killing Amnon. And it will be Absalom's hair that gets him killed as well, with great irony. And that's certainly what this is setting up here, the absurd amount of his hair and how he will die at the end of the story. Let's look at some details. So the word for cut the hair is literally a word for shaving, not the ordinary word for cutting, and it would apply to Joseph when Joseph shaved in order to come before Pharaoh. Samson, of course, known for his long hair, that when to cut it, his power was removed. And then we saw it earlier when the enemies of David cut half the face beards of the Israelites in order to insult them. And so it's 23 times in the Masoretic text, not in Kings. We don't hear about a lot of shaving. But here it is, where he cut his hair once a year. And you can only imagine how long that got. The hair is signaling the demise, although Hebrew does not have hair here. It's literally when he cut his head, which doesn't make sense in English, or literally when he shaved his head. So head, rosh, here is the word here. Later in the verse is se'ar, which is the word for hair. Notice it's similar to barley that we'll see, se'ar and se'ora, for what Absalom will set on fire in order to get Joab's attention in the next scene. So at the end of every year, he used to cut it, and it was heavy on him or glorious on him. Kabod, the Hebrew word meaning both heavy and glorious, and they're both relevant here. It will describe the weight, but it also certainly is suggesting it's glorious with that long hair. And there's certainly nothing in the Bible that has gender elements of hair here, that men can be long-haired and women can be long-haired, and as many artistic images from the early art until now have shown biblical males with long hair, including Jesus, of course, so we know nothing about the length of his hair. He weighed the hair of his head. Notice the word for weigh is shakel, just different verbs from shekel. So although shekel is normally understood as a coin, it's the standard use here for a measure in its weight. And you can see an image of that here, both of an individual shekel and of a balance with shekels and hair there. But that would be not enough hair to weigh 200 shekels, which would be roughly, or literally the king's stone, not weight, here it's an even, here a king's stone, would be about 6 pounds. And as this little clip from Healthline suggests, and others confirm it, even the long hair of a person would not weigh more than just a few ounces. So this is absurd for exaggeration to highlight Absalom's hair is his crowning glory. And if we miss that, then we really missed something the text is making a point of. And then it shifts gears completely here, and I'll compare it to 1818 in a minute. Born to Absalom, a phrase used to describe birth to David as well. But earlier we saw at least David's women named, which allowed us to trace down which of his children were half-siblings and which were full siblings. We know nothing about that here. Is it one woman, multiple women? And we know nothing about those sons, but the highlight is obviously the one daughter whose name is Tamar. And that's in contrast to what we heard about David, when he was in Jerusalem, he had more sons and daughters, but the sons were listed, but not the daughters. And the Tamar here, as my note below has, keeping the memory of the rape alive. The issue of the prequel has to do with what we see in 1818. We go ahead of that. Absalom in his lifetime had taken up and set for himself a pillar in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name as remembrance. And we can come up with fanciful ways to make those fit together, but the simple reality is they don't fit together. And the emphasis isn't on his sons anyway. The emphasis is on the daughter named Tamar, and he's trying to keep that together. She's a beautiful woman is a misleading translation. There's no woman in the Hebrew. Yefeth Mara, beautiful and shapely, we could say, beautiful in form, like Bathsheba, like her father that we just saw, like Sarai in Genesis and Rachel in Genesis, like Joseph in Genesis, and the cows in Pharaoh's dream, and David. So she's fitting in this long tradition. Doesn't matter. A woman's beauty can get her raped. It can also get her married. It can also distract from who she really is. What about a man's beauty? We've seen how Joseph's beauty leads Mrs. Potiphar to want him sexually, and we've certainly seen David has a share of women, but if he wasn't good looking but just was a powerful warrior, would that have made a difference? How does Absalom's physical beauty and the length of his hair affect what is going to unfold in the scene, in the contrast between David's reign and Absalom's reign? Is it an expression of his ego, perhaps? Well, we'll have to wait and find out. But what we see as it closes, it returns to the issue. Absalom lived or settled 2 full years in Jerusalem, as we heard back in 1323, without coming before the king's face. So all these years have gone by, and nothing has happened. We've not heard that David has done anything. We've not heard about anything in Jerusalem, and we've not heard about anything around the rest of David's children. It's just this focus. What is Absalom's goal in this point? Plainly, it's to see his father. That's why he's bothered to come back. What would he do when he got there? Well, we'll have to see next time. See you then for that. Bye-bye.